Hi, I'm Kat Rosenfield.
And I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and we are Feminine Chaos. And today we are going to start by talking about authenticity in all of its many forms. No, just in some of its forms. First, in terms of literature, what is authenticity in literature? So Kat wrote a really great article for Refinery 29 about the concept of hashtag own voices. So Kat, what are own voices? Like OWN, one's own voice. What is that in literature?
So Own Voices started out as a hashtag on Twitter, and it was designed as a way for readers of given identities to find books about characters of those identities written by authors who share those same identities. And it's basically like if you are a disabled person and you want to read about disabled people and you want to make sure that a disabled person wrote the novel, that's a good way to do it. And that was actually kind of where it started. I think it was an autistic author named Corinne Duvis, or Duvis, I can't pronounce her last name. So she started this hashtag, and it was for readers at the first blush. Then, as often happens in publishing, it got kind of picked up industry-wide, and gatekeepers within the industry who were very concerned about diversity and very concerned about identity saw it as a way to get more books by marginalized authors on shelves by having them write what they know, or more specifically, to write who they are. So it became a big thing. Like, we want books about gay people, Black people, Hispanic people, written by people of those identities. And it was one of those things. It was a good idea at the time. Like, you understand why people were interested in it and thought that it was going to be a good way to improve diversity in this industry that has been sorely lacking it for a long time. Unfortunately, it's sort of evolved within the past couple of years to become like a litmus test for whether you're allowed to write a given narrative. And it's also begun to expand into questionable areas like sexuality, gender identity, mental illness, trauma in general, where you have authors feeling like they have to disclose personal, private, sometimes medical information to prove that they are allowed to create a work of art in this sphere on this subject.
There's just so much with this topic. I'm going to try to have us not go for like 10 hours on it, even though I think we could, because there's just so much there. I think we could just start with this concept of diverse books. And like, I've seen, even that's a poodle there on my end. This whole notion of diverse books. What is, we need diverse, Izu? What is, see if that works. What does that mean to need diverse books? Because is it about the content of the book? Is it about, because this is something you could wonder, is it about the content of the book or the author? And I guess own voices is a way of saying both. It has to be both. And I guess there were a ton of things I found super interesting in your article, and I guess just to like go through some of them. One is this way that it's so that it can be seemingly quite, I may have to bring a poodle to the bedroom at some point, but we'll see. The way that it can be limiting in terms of what these authors are able to write, in terms of, I think, this notion of issue books, and what that does in terms of sort of, by implication, leaving the field of just regular books to, like, who gets to do that? Well, clearly people who do not have any sort of identity that they are associated with. So it seems like a way that it's meant to help marginalized writers, but ends up sort of pigeonholing them, limiting them.
Absolutely.
And turning what they can do into something that's literature adjacent, maybe, rather than just, literature. And it makes me think of, I feel like I should show the Philip Roth shelf, as I have in the past, the Philip Roth shelf. Philip Roth would always insist, like, he's just an American writer, not an American Jewish writer, or whatever, and this would always be controversial. But I think there is this way that you know, okay, I think I might need to.
I wonder if I can pause. Let me
If
just
you can
see.
pause for a second.
Okay, pausing. And we're back. Okay.
And we're back. Poodle dealt with it. Yes, this way that issue book, making it so that somebody's identity is kind of the thing they have to offer ends up limiting them.
Right. Well, you said literature adjacent, and it's certainly fiction adjacent. Where
Fiction adjacent, yes.
as soon as you step outside the realm of describing something, whether it's a character or a setting or a plot point that you have yourself personally experienced, you're guilty of being inauthentic, and
absolutely,
you can be accused of having gotten it wrong. And because the concept of imagination and being capable of or permitted to imagine the lives of people who are not like you has become very fraught. It's seen as problematic to defend your right to do that. It's seen as like an expression of privilege.
Well, exactly. So I'm going to jump ahead to, so I have like a million like notes on this because I just find this is so fascinating. But I guess, this was one of the things I wrote down is this the end of fiction. So that basically if nothing can veer from the author's personal experience, not just in terms of these like identity categories, but also really highly specific things like a mental health diagnosis or really all these sort of, where somebody's from in the world, all these different overlapping things. If you're only like, could somebody who's an only child write about a character with a sibling or vice versa? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's
how
unlikely.
far does it go? And I think the fact, like, this might sound a little sort of slippery slope and odd, but like from your article, that seems like there are a lot of different categories that this can cover, and it just seems like it's headed towards a place where fiction itself as a concept is problematic.
Yeah. Well, any experience that you can find a way to tie into a form of oppression, which is kind of the term oppression Olympics gets thrown around a lot, but there is a certain amount of kind of seeking out of ways to claim marginalized status, because it does, especially depending on which community you're in, offer either special status or special protection. A good example of, somebody who started out kind of with the protection of their own voices status and then stepped out of line and immediately got canceled is this guy Kasoko Jackson, who wrote A Place for Wolves. That was an Own Voices book. It was about a gay Black character. He's a gay Black author. But because he sent it against the backdrop of the war in Kosovo, he lost the protection of being an Own Voices author because he was accused of having handled the parts that weren't relevant to his life, this setting, and his villain. He was accused of having handled them insensitively.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what that story especially illustrates is how it isn't in a way that it helps an author to be of a marginalized background. It's just as in the world in general, being marginalized it's marginalization, but it's this sort of illusion that will help, but then it ends up backfiring. And what this really reminded me of, actually, not to keep harping on this topic every time, but the college admissions essays and this notion that people commonly will have that, if you have some kind of sob story, it's easier to get into college. Yeah. When in fact, no, if you're rich and your parents can buy the college a new gym or a new library, it's easier to get into college. But then there's this other path open to a few where you can, if you are able to properly sort of sell that narrative, suffering can help. But it's not that suffering in and of itself is helpful. And in fact, it can, it's complicated. But it reminds me a lot of the sort of college admissions essay genre, where it's about properly packaging your suffering. It's not even about just the suffering itself. Which is, I think, like that came up in your piece in terms of where one of the authors said something about having to sell yourself, not just your writing.
Yes. And I mean, that was something that a lot of the authors that I spoke to brought up. They described being kind of treated like mascots for their racial or ethnic or religious background. And where the people who are gatekeepers in publishing, who are generally white and wealthy, because that's who can afford to work in this industry, that doesn't pay anything and it is based in New York City, and where you have like zero opportunities for advancement forever. They have very particular ideas about what a marginalized person's narrative should look like. And so they think that you should be, if you're, like a Black American author, you should be writing books centered on oppression and injustice. And that if you're not doing that, then somehow you're not writing an authentically Black book.
And what if you would rather write about Martians or write about, I don't know, like...
Yeah, but then there is a certain extent to which, so I have a hair in my eye. You are seen as, I don't want to say like a traitor to your cause, but you're not creating a story that it's already been decided that nobody else can create. So then, that story doesn't, about the marginalized, the story of oppression, the story of injustice, doesn't end up getting written because only you, a person of a given identity, can write that story. So it's seen as undesirable, and authors are just, have described being like steered away from writing about stuff that's more frivolous or more fantasy oriented, just because white gatekeepers basically have a very specific idea of what kind of stories they should be creating.
Or even, I would wonder if it's also steered away from writing realist fiction that's just not about issues, that's not about the issues of the day or the issues that specifically are associated with with a particular sort of identity. So I had tweeted about this recently. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, but not really sure what to do with it. There was a Dear Prudence letter recently from somebody who I believe was a woman marrying another woman, where her parents weren't going to go to the wedding because they were estranged, but their estrangement had nothing to do with homophobia. The parents are just like bad news for some other totally unrelated reason. And she was wondering whether she needed to tell people that the parents were not homophobic, because people would always assume, oh, surely they're not coming to your wedding because they don't approve of same-sex marriage, when that was not, in fact, it was real, but just was not that.
That is interesting.
And I think there's something, I just feel like there's something similar there with this notion of that if you have a marginalized identity in any sort, that somehow you're like not even permitted the everyday problems that cut across identity, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a overall sense, and I've seen people say this, basically in, so many words, that if you are a marginalized person, then at no point in your life do you ever have an experience that cuts across that marginalization, that your marginalization defines your entire life, to the point where a character in a book who is, say, Black, has to experience oppression on the page, related to their Blackness, or it's not realistic and it's not authentic.
It's all this tricky. I mean, there are a couple angles I want to get at this from that are sort of intertwined, but I mean, one thing that really struck me was this notion of, and this is something I've written about in terms of like privilege acknowledgement and this culture of privilege acknowledgement, where there's this expectation that if your privilege is checked, that you answer with your true whatever. So if somebody says, surely you grew up with a trust fund, and you didn't, then you're supposed to like take your parents' tax statements from the past 30 years and be like, well, see, look at this. Clearly, how could there have been a trust? You know what I mean? Where there's this notion that everything is to be shared, and that if you don't share, that's the only possible explanation is privilege, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's something kind of, that was really what jumped out at me maybe the most in your piece, was this notion that you would have to tell your publisher your sexual orientation, your mental health history, all of these things that might be, if you don't want to tell your publisher, it seems like...
Or your public. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is, there's this expectation of authors being accessible on social media, especially the ones who write for young people. And this has played out in some really pretty awful ways. Even post-publication, a few years ago, this woman, Veronica Roth, wrote a book where people decided that she had mishandled a rendering of chronic pain. And she finally, in this interview, was like, look, I experience chronic pain and I really don't want to talk about this. Like, it's really none of anybody's business. But it's increasingly, once you have it decided that authenticity is everything, that authenticity is more important than quality, or like the sole determining factor in whether a story should be told or not, it's not just that authors feel compelled to reveal this information, but that people feel entitled to demand it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing that kind of, I guess it frustrates me both in the sense of like the sort of privacy violation and in terms of what it means about writing and about fiction writing specifically, because I think there's something nice about that you can label a text fiction, even if all the names in it are the names of your relatives. You can name it fiction. And in a way that's like, okay, people can be offended. People can feel like they were somehow, like, let's forget about the extreme case where somebody has used the names from real life but said, actually, this is fiction. But let's say somebody feels they see themselves in a novel. If it's fiction, if it's labeled fiction, it's not just about like plausible deniability in terms of whether or not somebody's offended, but you are not hurting somebody's reputation if there's a fictional character, because like it's fiction, it's made up. You know what I mean? You have the freedom to invent, and also the public has no way of knowing what's true or not. And the public can make guesses and all of this, especially if it's about people who are somewhat in the public eye, mm-hmm. But it's just this kind of escape hatch fiction, and I feel like once that's gone, once all that's possible is some form of memoir or not autofiction in the sense of like doing something interesting with the genre, but like the sense of it has to be actually true or it can't have been written because it's too upsetting, too problematic, whatever. Mm-hmm. There just isn't fiction anymore, like as it used to exist. And I guess this also gets to the other thing that I want to be sure we talk about, which is the concept of sensitivity readers and what, and the more I think about this, the more I feel like it should just not, like, I'm going to take a completely radical stance on this, which is no, should not exist, because it's like two things about this get to me, and you can tell me whether I'm like way off because I'm coming at this from not really a publishing world perspective at all. But best case scenario, right? It's just about sort of authenticity in the sense of details, like getting the details right. You could say, fine, well, that's an editing question. Like, maybe somebody is describing like a phone that didn't exist in that era or in that, in that country at that time or whatever, and somebody wouldn't have had a Nokia phone in, whatever, like Korea in 1812 or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, but even there, I guess I wonder, like, isn't there something about fiction where you need to just kind of like lean into the fact you are getting this one author's inherently limited perspective, and the author and editors can do some amount to correct for that. But the fact is, like, a single authored work of fiction is inherently narrow. It is inherently just this one person's view from this one part of the world at this one time. And maybe that's fine. And rather, because I feel like the whole concept of a sensitivity reader is this notion that you could correct for that's somehow realizable. And it kind of fits in with this broader like privilege awareness project goal, where that's this unrealizable goal of everybody's perfectly aware of all their privileges and of what all their privileges imply at all times. And it just seems like maybe the better thing to do is to just like not have these unrealizable goals.
Yeah. Well, the argument being made is that if a person is trying to write about the perspective of somebody who's not them, or more specifically about somebody with whom they don't share an identity, and that identity is a marginalized person, that it causes harm, in the ether, or to readers specifically, or, to vulnerable children if they get it, quote unquote, wrong. The thing
there's
about
no right. I guess this is just what frustrates me, because you're only ever getting one, like, even if there's a sensitivity reader brought in, like, I mean, and I know this exists because I've read about it, that there are sensitivity readers of my own background, that there are Jewish sensitivity readers. And I guess I just think what one Jewish person would find, I know from reading about this, what one Jewish person would find offensive, another Jewish person might not.
Right. Well, what's interesting is how you go back and forth between the notion of offensive and the notion of authentic.
Exactly.
These two things they're not synonyms for each other, but they get conflated, and it's interesting how that happens. That kids deserve to have their experiences rendered accurately and sensitively. And that these are basically the same thing. It's really kind of odd. But the thing that's interesting to me, and I'm with you that I don't think sensitivity reading as a thing should exist. And I was convinced of this by two separate people who I interviewed for this piece, one white, one black, and they independently made the same point, which is that the whole concept is like fundamentally racist. That you're saying, hey, like, you're black, will you read this book with a black person in it and make sure that we got the black parts right? Like, because you guys are all the same. So, there's, even if you have nothing else in common with this character, surely you can say if it's right or wrong or authentic or not. You're treating this entire identity like it's monolithic, and like it's the sole defining factor in how a person lives their life. And that's racist in the
oh, yeah.
And essentializing.
Well, it's also pigeonholing people within the publishing industry. And I don't know in terms of the pay, but I'm assuming sensitivity reading is not like raking in the big bucks.
It's not great. I mean, and it's like, it doesn't pay super well, but it's also just deeply inappropriate. I mean, somebody pointed out that, like, the idea that you can have, say like a Dominican woman who grew up in Queens in the 80s, and that she's going to be able to read a book about a Mexican kid in Houston in the year 2018, and that just because they're both Hispanic, she's going to be able to say whether his character is authentic or not, or whether his experience is authentic or not. That's
the problem with this notion of identity that limits itself to sort of census categories, to, checkbox categories.
Yeah.
Where it's something, it's not that these categories are meaningless. It's just that, there's a lot more in terms of even just identity. But just to get back to this notion of the conflation of authenticity and lack of offensiveness. I mean, I think that's super fascinating. And just this notion also of what does it mean for fiction to offend? And the question is when is the book offensive, and when is it that a character in the book says something offensive? You know what I mean? And I think this gets to this notion of, like, I mean, a book could be entirely, like, if a book is showing the world as it is, it could be super authentic and could be very upsetting and offensive, because it could be showing the truth about how people talk when somebody of a different group isn't around or something. You know what I mean? And it could be very hurtful, but also entirely authentic. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't quite add up. And I guess it's just also this notion that the goal of fiction would always be showing the world as it is. Both, it seems wrong sort of in these two ways, right? In terms of both, that's not what fiction's always even striving for, and there's no guarantees that would even lead to something inoffensive, and then in turn, is inoffensive even always the goal? Like, it just, I guess the main thing that I keep coming back to with this, and I've written about this like a while ago in terms of TV, but it seems maybe even more so with YA, that attempts at correcting for well, I guess the question is it that attempts at correcting for racism or a lack of diversity within an industry backfire, or is it that those are not ever what this was in the first place, and that this is some sort of cynical attempt to kind of profit from a trend in sort of superficial diversity? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it can be both. And there's, you've got people who see diversity being called for and who are like, okay, this can be a cash cow for us. You've got people who genuinely believe that the industry needs to be diversified. And then you've got, disagreement within that faction on how it should be done. Some people want to see publishing itself, employing more people of marginalized identities. Some people want to see more authors. Some people want to see more characters. Mm-hmm. And some people want all of that, Mm-hmm. And then there's also the question of not just, that you were talking about, like, is it okay for an author to depict somebody behaving offensively or insensitively in the context of a fictional story? And often the answer to that from, well, at least some influencers in the YA community, is that no, you can't depict that unless it's like corrected for on the page. You need to see that person instructed in some way within the narrative as to why they're doing wrong.
Well, I think the person, I keep coming back to this notion that Émile Zola, who's in the Z section of the alphabetized books and not here, so I can't like flash his books. I think he'd be like the only author who'd maybe kind of make the cut from like the 19th century, because with naturalism, it was such like meticulous research. So he was really, really into getting the details right. And there would be a lot of not very subtle moralizing. Mm-hmm. I mean, he wouldn't tick the own voices box always, depending on, or most of the time, because certainly like, it's not that he was being a coal miner or for that matter, a Jewish banker or whatever, but I don't know. It bothers me both in terms of what it means about fiction and in terms of what it means about just further screwing over people who are marginalized, and in terms of what it means about making people reveal things about themselves that they shouldn't feel they have to. I don't know. It just,
yeah.
The story.
Well, I mean, it additionally, like, for me, I think the main thing is that it suggests that common humanity is not a thing, and that empathy for people unlike us is impossible, at least if you are of a given identity and along certain lines. Like, one of the things that's remarkable about the idea of own voices is that people of oppressor identities are not allowed to write about people of marginalized identities because they can't do it. Like, they're gonna get it wrong. They lack the ability to authentically and sensitively, without help, render a character of this identity. But that people of marginalized identities don't have this problem. And it's such like a kind of a form of magical thinking where it's like you have this idea that oppression is a wound on this collective psyche, like that everybody of a given identity can tap into. It's like practically Jungian. I don't know.
This is actually kind of the perfect transition to another topic about what people are allowed to do or not, and whether that's even the right framing for such controversies. If you're ready to move. Okay. So the story that has most captivated me in the news this week in terms of feminine chaos-ish topics has been the Chinese restaurant controversy. Oh my goodness. Or the Chinese restaurant controversy. So I guess I'll try to introduce this as best as I can. So a woman named, I have this somewhere in my notes, Ariel Haspel, who's a wellness influencer, which means she has an Instagram on which she appears well. I don't know, healthy, robust.
She's like a goopy
healthy
personality.
Healthy, yes.
Yeah.
Not robust in a euphemistic for large, and definitely not that sort of robust in the euphemism for like healthy, strong, able to probably, if she goes to a fitness class, it's not like when I go to the postnatal fitness class and they're like, Phoebe needs the lighter weights and they hand me them. Probably not that sort of thing. But anyway, the point is this woman opened a Chinese style, clean Chinese, that's her word for it, clean Chinese food restaurant called Lucky Lee's on University Place, I believe, in New York. So down the street from my old French department there. And the fact that it's a clean Chinese restaurant as versus
that was her big mistake using that word.
Yes, seems to be where a controversy of sorts. Now, I have not had time before this to check how much controversy was actually stirred. It was enough for there to be a New York Times article about it and a little bit of coverage elsewhere, but it could, I don't know, like, I mean, the restaurant is still open apparently and has customers, including some Chinese customers, according to that New York Times article. So it doesn't seem like the restaurant was canceled. But the reason, well, there were a few reasons people were upset about it, and we will get into what those were. I mean, the big one was this notion of clean and clean food. And what does it mean to speak of food as clean? And I think some people, quite understandably, interpreted that to mean that she was saying that other Chinese food was dirty. And this wasn't just because of the word clean. It was some post she'd done that was something about, unlike that other, like, gloppy, brown sauce, greasy Chinese food, other people, perhaps Chinese people, were selling her Chinese food would not make you feel sick, which in turn taps into these offensive notions about Chinese food being loaded with MSG, about MSG itself being harmful, which apparently it's not. So that was basically the sort of the main reason, the sort of big picture reason, I guess. But I think we'll get into that there were some other, maybe more subtle reasons why this particular Chinese restaurant opened. Well, also the name Lucky Lee's sounds somewhat Chinese, but apparently it's because her husband, who is also white, and also they're both Jewish, which came up sort of in her defense of the whole thing in a strange way that I didn't totally understand. But his name just happens to be Lee, like his first name. So it seemed, I guess, to some to be deceptive. And I guess I feel like where this story, I don't know how loud the poodle is at this point, probably pretty loud. But she has a lot of thoughts about this topic that she just can only express through woofing. Sorry, can you just pause it for a second? Thank you.
All right, pausing. And we're back again.
Poodle has been dealt with, perhaps. So I think one thing, so just to contextualize the story, I mean, it is to do with this question of cultural appropriation in food, and it does seem, like we were discussing before, like these, like there's something gendered about it. So I was looking up just about some previous controversies like it, and they seem to also involve women restaurateuses, I don't know, whatever. So one was something in Portland where two white women made some burritos after observing, I believe, Mexican women making burritos, and then this was problematic. And then closer to, well, my current and past homes, a bar in Crown Heights called Summerhill, opened by a white woman from Toronto. Summerhill being a very posh and quite white neighborhood in downtown Toronto. And this was this bar that she was claiming had bullet holes as the decor or something, and this was very problematic as well.
Oh.
I don't think they were real bullet holes. It was some whole weird thing where it was like a lot of sort of like very dense marketing. Same
Was
generalized.
the idea supposed to be that the bar was like in the ghetto and had been shut?
Something like that. But then the fact that the name, I guess just now that I live in Toronto and I know what that is, it just seems so weird. I mean, I don't know what would be any equivalent, because our viewers could be all over the world. So basically posh neighborhood.
Although nobody, like, who in New York actually knows that? Like I had
right. I don't think anyone would. I mean, I don't think there's a tremendous New York to Toronto tourism path. I think there should be, but that's the subject for another day.
It's funny. That reminds me of being in Todos Santos, Mexico, staying at this inn where the place had been shot up during like the Mexican, I don't know, whatever war, civil war. And there had been, I don't know my history clearly, but it was full of bullet holes and they showed them off very proudly. Delighted. Yeah.
They should just transfer that wall over to Brooklyn. No, just kidding. No, I don't know. It seems like, I guess what struck me was that these seem to be, and we'll get at why I think this is maybe relevant, that these were all stories to do with women restaurateurs in a food world where that's very unusual, right? Where most people starting restaurants, as I understand it, are men.
Right.
Certainly the ones who get written up, all of that. So, but I guess, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, I think I kind of want to offer, I don't know, if not a defense, at least like some perspective from like the kind of wellness.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was what I wanted to ask you about exactly. Was this clean? What was clean doing here?
Right. So you told me that previously there's been a lot of focus on like clean as the idea of centering on where does the food come from.
Oh yeah. So maybe you should explain the wellness one. You should explain the wellness.
Right. So yeah, just understandably, if you are dealing with a lifetime of stereotypes about Chinese food being made of like cats and dogs, it makes sense that, you might balk at the word clean, but it actually has a pretty specific and a robust meaning within like the fitness, nutrition, wellness community. And it just means basically eating whole non-processed foods. So, things like the Whole30 or paleo, or just like, if you are a fitness person and you're like making, you're doing like meal prep and you're making your chicken breast or whatever, like to take to work, like that would be considered eating clean. Like you make avocado toast, that's eating clean because it's whole foods that you're, constructing.
So just to be clear, if I do as I do like every other day and spend $4.50 Canadian on a Queen Amande, this Breton pastry that's one layer of butter, then a layer of sugar, then a layer of butter, a layer of sugar, is that clean?
Is it processed or is it baked site at the place where you?
Oh, I don't know. Probably not on site, not in Toronto.
Right. So like if it's mass produced,
what if it's not what if it's baked by a small bakery, but then
an artisanal baker?
What if it's expensive, but really, really greasy and sweet? Is that clean?
Well, all of the sugar, especially if it's refined sugar,
it's definitely refined,
might disqualify it. Usually like clean eating involves, it's like no processed foods and probably no white sugar. And like, you want to stay away from like, often it means like no gluten, although that's kind of iffy. I see. But the idea is that you're trying to avoid foods that cause inflammation or bloating. And this is where like, I want to say like no shade on Chinese food. I love Chinese food. I eat it all the time. But if you are somebody who monitors your body closely and, are in the business of observing what effects certain foods have on you versus other foods, Chinese food has a lot of sodium in it and it does make you puffy.
I think that might get at partly why the story annoyed people, because I think this notion of clean eating, as you defined it, does annoy people more than the notion of clean eating as I think had existed previously. Well, I don't know about exactly the timeline, but I would say probably previously. So where I saw this story kind of fitting in has to do with something that existed maybe like a decade ago and is still going on, the sort of Michael Pollan, Mark Bittman, Alice Waters notion of knowing where your food comes from. That is a notion that I have thought for years now has kind of, even if the individuals involved in it are well-meaning, has a kind of subtle racism to it in a sort of like systemic way. Again, not like, oh, these people, I don't think any of those individuals are racists. That's not where I'm, coming from.
Is this like the slow food movement?
Kind of like that. I mean, this notion, like this notion that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that are kind of sometimes overlapping, but this notion that you should know where each ingredient you're eating comes from. So I lived in Brooklyn at the time when this was really a thing. And it would be like this sort of like the farm to table thing, like where everything, if you're in a certain types of grocery stores or certain types of restaurants, it's like, what is the source? Which farm did each thing come from? And it was parodied on Portlandia. Like, this is not an obscure thing, but basically what this did, I thought at the time, was if you eat like that, it rules out eating in kind of what would once be called ethnic restaurants apart and doing what would have once been called, I guess, ethnic grocery shopping, because what if you don't know exactly what the ingredients are? What if you don't know what farm the chicken and the chicken dumplings came from? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that while the question is, was the exclusionary aspect of this a feature, a bug, or not, or some combination, And I think prior to this sort of food movement in that incarnation, it had been the height of sophistication to go somewhere, to like discover, some, obviously this would be its whole own discussion, something like an out of the way place in Queens, and that this switched it out to be like, no, and gets back to this notion of authenticity, that the really, like, it seemed to me that in Brooklyn, there would be people who were kind of selling this notion of authenticity, who were themselves new arrivals, who were claiming that what they were selling was more authentic than what had been there before because of this sort of farm connection. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I saw this kind of as fitting in a weird way with that, but that somehow would always get a pass, like this ingredient traceability thing, because it was always kind of like vaguely tied in with this notion of like, this is actually the only ethical way to eat or something. Right. And I feel like once, like what the way you put it in terms of like the basicness angle, like we were talking about, like for somebody to say, no, this is about not being puffy, mm-hmm. is not cool, basically, the way that saying this is about farm to table is. Like the hipster, mainly male version of it, where it's like, no, this is really about ethics. It has nothing to do with puffiness. Right. Kind of gets a pass. Whereas moment about puffiness,
it's like basic white bitches.
Yes, exactly. So I think that was what was so interesting to me about this, was that for at least a decade now, there's been this notion of that you couldn't just go, if you're adhering to this food movement, you couldn't just go to a supermarket in Chinatown and buy whichever condiments strike your fancy, which, I mean, I'm biased here, was just like a thing I spend a lot of my time doing. In Toronto, it's, not difficult and something I like to do. Because you have to look at the ingredients. What's that preservative? What's that? Would my great grandmother have recognized that preservative in that hot sauce? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that all kind of got a pass. And then there's this, and it doesn't. And it's interesting. And I wonder how much has to do with the timing of it, and how much has to do with the sort of milieu and the gendered nature of it, whether it's because this is a woman selling something that's sort of diety.
Yeah, I think it's because it's seen as like Gwyneth Paltrow adjacent. Certainly, people love to hate her. The way that this place was marketed, talking about like, food that makes you feel good or makes you feel clean inside, that's like a very goopy kind of a message to adopt. And it's funny because, the people that I know in real life who are actually the most in tune with this are male bodybuilders who, can like tell you exactly how much water to drink to, cause yourself to either bloat or not bloat, and like, which foods to eat and which to stay away from. Like, they can look at your food log and be like, that is why you're bloated right there, that thing you ate. But, I think that maybe like they don't gather in these mainstream places where it's normal to be on the hunt for things to kind of judge or get outraged about. Whereas, female like nutrition and wellness Instagrammers are a lot easier to hate, and they're a lot more visible. Yeah. And I mean, there is also, as we have discussed, many times, including on this podcast, the fact that basic white women right now are kind of like an approved target. If you want to kick somebody, like that's a good bet,
Yeah, that exactly. I mean, that's, I think, what frustrated me about this story was that I thought this, I mean, so I do not do the clean eating. I, goodness knows, probably should eat more along those lines than I do. But I really like pastries is the problem.
Yeah, it's honestly not much fun at all.
And I am trying more in that direction for the obvious. I was enormously pregnant and have had the baby and, such reasons. But so I have eaten a vegetable already today. So just, I would like to.
I'm glad that you've registered that, I just
would like people to know. But
this is like publicly saying that you did the chore,
I did the chore. There was kale. It was had. But I think, I guess what frustrated me about the story though was that, was that it seemed like a lot was being placed on this one woman and what she is or is not allowed to do in terms of opening a Chinese themed restaurant, when it seems like there is a real racism issue. There is a systemic issue here. It's not all or even mostly on her personally. And what she's guilty of is being a little dense, is being a little clueless, is being insensitive, but the thing she has done wrong is not open a Chinese restaurant without having researched the history, the long and, varied and complex history of Chinese cuisine. I think it's absolutely fine, as far as I'm concerned, for people to open restaurants despite not having written dissertations in that field. I think the issues to do with food and race are real, but it shouldn't all hinge kind of on her. She just seemed like a weird target for this, and it seemed like what we're talking about, that like it was an opportunity to kind of, it just was too delicious to mock the sort of clean eating thing coming from a Gwyneth Paltrow wannabe type, and to say, and it's racist, to have it all converge. When I think if it's really about what's the most, problematic in terms of the food movement's relationship to race, I would think it's not this lady.
Yeah.
But she's just an easier target.
Well, it's interesting. I just read, I haven't seen the details, but it made me think of this topic shortly before we hopped on Skype together, was that the, what are they, like Milk Bar has renamed its crack pie to something else. Interesting. That was like a long-standing source of anguish or, upset.
Right.
And, I think along similar grounds, the idea was that it was insensitive.
Right. I feel like I have seen this link and been meaning to click on it about that story.
It's also inauthentic because the pie never contained actual crack.
Well, in that case. I think like with all these cultural appropriation stories, I always come back to the same thing, which is that this framing of what people are or are not allowed to do kind of misses the point and tends to backfire, causes people to not take the underlying issues seriously because it sounds absurd. This notion of what people are or are not allowed to cook, like my pantry pretty much allows me to cook like Italian food, Japanese food, and some Chinese food. I am not Italian. I am not Japanese. I am not Chinese. I have very little desire to cook Ashkenazi Jewish cuisine. So, I mean, what, you know, is that but then that seems irrelevant, because the question is not what I'm allowed to cook. The question is, and I wouldn't even say it's a question of this like profiting or not. I mean, I think
that is actually a part of it. You know, it's the reason why nobody is coming into your pantry to yell at you, but people are, you know, more likely to
certainly
get upset at the, I don't know, at the restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I guess I'm not a big fan of this notion of food as clean or not, but at the same time, I understand, you know, I'm also not a big fan of judging those who are, if that makes sense. Like, I guess, I feel like this notion that the problem was that a woman who is not Chinese was serving Chinese food seems kind of like a red herring here, and that the issue was more this, the implication. So I guess this was complicated, right? Because there's this notion that she was on the one hand implying that there are not Chinese restaurants run by Chinese people that already are doing this, which evidently there are. But to me, it seems like it's also a problem that for food to be viewed, like there is something inherently exclusionary, even if it's inadvertent, about viewing food as needing to be sort of clean in that way. And it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of the generally male, sort of like Anthony Bourdain model of just eating everything. You know what I mean? Like going to everywhere in the world, just whatever it is, just sort of connecting with other people through food is something that's only possible really if you'll eat everything. But then that in turn gets in this sort of gendered way of like, is that even ever as accessible to women? For a variety of reasons. Oh, I was rambling there, but I'm just obsessed with this story. I just think it has everything. And the Jewish angle is super weird that like, because as a Jewish American, she grew up eating Chinese food, which I, Jewish American, also did, that somehow meant that maybe it wasn't appropriation, which seems like it was kind of a weird defense. I don't know.
People will tie themselves in knots to avoid, you know, to explain why this accusation of having done something racially insensitive is not valid. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so often like these conversations so often unravel along those lines, because for a certain subset, especially of like progressive or liberal-minded white women, being accused of racism is the most horrifying thing that you can possibly imagine.
Well, because it's not going to be sexism.
Right. But it's like, you know, having, you know, you consider yourself an ally. So to be told that you've done something racially insensitive is like, I think that maybe cynically, part of the reason that people like to, you know, bring the conversation to that place is because the response is, in a trollish way, fun to watch. This, you know, the scrambling and, you know, the
squirming, yeah,
apologize, and yeah.
Oh boy, we're doing well with our segues here, because I think, unless you have more to say about this particular story, I think.
No,
So we're going to talk about slurs now.
Slurs.
The slurs segment. But this totally relates, because the reason that in a roundabout way that we came to the topic of slurs was an article. Oh boy, where was this? City Journal? I don't think it was City Journal, but it was something, or was it City Journal?
It was City Journal, yeah.
City Journal, okay. About a conference that happened apparently in Toronto. I missed it, not happening in my apartment. Or at the postnatal fitness classes I go to, and that's about all I can speak to in terms of Toronto. But there was a conference happening here about an education conference, and someone wrote up something for City Journal. I don't believe the author attended this conference, but the author had looked in detail at the program for the conference, and had found, and some of this article kind of I wasn't so thrilled with, because it struck me as this sort of usual from the right, look at these academics covering something silly thing. But then there was one thing where I did take it a bit more seriously. There was apparently a panel on critical, not just Becky studies, critical Becky studies. Becky being, as per the author of the City Journal piece, a slur about basic white women, basic bitches of the white variety. Becky also a first name possessed by some women, not all of whom are white. Anyway,
all of whom probably really regret having that name.
Boy, there's an article that actually interviews, this was from like a few years ago, I think, interviews women who have names that are these stereotype names like that. And interestingly, and the article kind of pretends like this is something, and then there are some men's names too, but it's like, no, this is a thing with women's names. They're like, it's not to the same extent, I think. But anyway, critical Becky studies about white women and white women's role in racism. Now, what I thought was tricky here was, on the one hand, I do think there's much to be said about and researched about white women historically and currently, and racism, whether this is questions of white women calling the cops, whether this is like, there was a new really fascinating sounding book about the sort of previously untold story of white women's role in US slavery as slave owners. There's a lot there. It's real, it's stuff to talk about and to research. The question is the Becky framing, and is Becky a slur? And I guess what the first thing I needed to know when I saw this and started frantically Googling about was, were there white men at all involved in the Becky Studies panel? And I found at least one, yes. And that somehow got to me. So that gets us in a roundabout way to this question of, does it matter who says a term to decide if it's a slur or not? Like, because I was kind of saying, if the person using the term Becky is a woman of color, maybe I'm not as bothered by it. If it's a white man, then I feel like it's misogynistic and not actually about anti-racism at all.
See, I'm on the side of it's always a slur, and I think that part of the thing about the use of the word slur, it reminds me a lot about some of the conversations that take place in left-wing spaces about the use of the word censorship, where it's like, we know that censorship is bad, so whatever we're doing, it can't possibly be that. Ditto slurs, like slurs are bad. So this word that we love to use to malign a group of people on, based on a characteristic they can't control, it can't possibly be a slur. It has to be something else because, using a slur would be bad, but we want to keep doing the thing we're doing. So I don't know. I mean, you can argue that it doesn't carry as much cultural weight as something like the N-word or
certainly not something like Becky. I mean,
but I think that a big part of what makes something a slur is, how it's used and the intent with which it's used. And, calling a white woman a Becky is, you can argue that it's meant to describe a particular real set of attitudes and behaviors, but to me that's in the same way that like calling a woman a slut might describe a particular set of attitudes and behaviors, it's also intended to malign their character and imply that they're despicable.
Right. I mean, I think there's two things with Becky so one is that I think, especially, and I'm going to say especially if this is coming from a white man, after that, any man maybe, just because I think there's this way that this concept can be a cover for misogyny in the sense of like, oh, but it's really just white women I'm talking about. And then it'll just be some super sexist thing about women in general. But like sexism posing as anti-racism from white male allies, it's just, this is thing. No, don't do that. It just gets to me. It really bothers me. But then there's this question of conflating, and this has been something, I know I wrote about it in my book, but then I really noticed it much more, this was later, when there was the reaction to the first Women's March and this notion of the sort of inauthentic, to tie it all together, the protesters, like, who were wearing the pussy hats and were like from the suburbs, and they weren't really like the real like activist young people who are a little cooler maybe, you know, and that the sort of basicness would enter into it there, where basically there's this conflation of a basic aesthetic with sort of having the wrong politics or even being genuinely hateful. And I think that's really bad, because even though having the wrong aesthetic is something that, or having the wrong, by according to people, you know, thinking like this, obviously people can decide their aesthetic. Anybody can change their hairstyle, buy different clothing. It's possible, but it's not actually, there's nothing wearing whatever it is, Uggs, or I don't even know what these days it is the outfit. Whatever, wearing a sort of conventional outfit as a young woman, or a not so young woman, is not the same as it's not anything politically, and conversely, having an interesting outfit doesn't mean you have radical politics. Mm-hmm. So I think there's just something annoying about it in that respect.
My question is whether the word Becky is even aimed that much at young women anymore. I see it used to describe middle-aged women much more often, and it makes me wonder if part of this is like people just kind of lashing out at what they perceive to be the uncool, stodgy, like not hip to the correct values generation above them, or
that's
or at their moms.
I think that might be, yes. Definitely. I think there is the whole sort of, this has to be a topic for another time, the whole sort of like the ageism and wokeness,
right?
Possible, you know, like if all cultural products from prior to whichever minute we are in are problematic, therefore it must be that so too are all the people behind them, strangely somehow, especially the women, and yet that's supposed to not have anything to do with the ageism against specifically women in society. Right. Kind of a side note, but yeah, I think that's right. And I think this also gets into this question of the problematic feminists, as in like any feminist who has, you know, the gall to be over 25, you know, because that's not good. Definitely very problematic for feminists to age out of their mid-20s.
We should really stop. We should stop doing that.
Definitely a problem, which kind of gets to, well, there were a couple other, so what we're talking about with slurs, obviously, as is probably clear at this point, is not the terms that everybody understands to be slurs and are widely recognized as slurs, and there's nothing really to say about it. But these terms that are kind of like, are they slurs? Are they not? Or what is that even the right term? So then another that I had seen, which struck me for obvious reasons, was somebody had tweeted that white Jews is a slur, or I don't know if they use the word slur, but that it's like very offensive to say white Jews. And this jumped out at me because, as the pallor would suggest, you know, so I was like, first I thought, well, I'm definitely white, I'm definitely Jewish. If I say that, am I is that a slur against myself? But then I kind of get it in a roundabout way why it would be considered, like, if not offensive, then just kind of frustrating, this notion that that it's a way of trying to fit the topic of anti-Semitism into the topic of racism, specifically anti-Black racism in the US, saying that anti-Semitism, because it doesn't kind of fit in that, doesn't count, and then in some roundabout way. But I guess I'm not persuaded that white Jews is a slur.
Inherently, I would say no. My sense is that, you know, anything can, you know, if it's said with a sneer, it can feel like a slur and it can be meant as a slur, and that doesn't necessarily mean it is one, but that's what makes the concept of a slur so interesting, like, because it implies, you know, to begin with, having a special word, but, you know, the category is clearly a little bit more flexible than that in terms of what can register, even if it's just descriptive.
Well, maybe there can be some kind of intermediary category of words where it's not like the word itself would need to be like, with asterisks or something, but where...
Yeah. I don't know. It reminds me of like, to really throw this back, when I was in like middle school, there was a group of girls who bullied me really badly. And one of the things that they did it's incredible when I think back on it, was that they would say my name, but they would say it like it was something disgusting, and it just hearing my own name was like, oh God, like that's terrible.
Yeah.
Like I feel maligned, and it really had everything to do with tone and what kind of sentiment I knew.
I think most things that people say to each other in middle school probably... I think so. So since we don't have a ton of time left, and I want to make sure we discuss the most controversial thing last, is TERF a slur? Trans exclusionary radical feminists. Some say it's a slur. Others say it is a group of hateful people who are just being described. Are we going to have a determination on this once and for all on our podcast here?
I don't know. I mean, I would say I have never seen it used just to describe ideology in a neutral way. So I would say probably a slur, I think it meets most of the criteria.
I think the reason this came up was partly because there was a New York Times op-ed whose author described the op-ed, whose author, not, I believe, trans herself, but an ally, described this as TERF bashing in the tweet, which was very controversial at the time. But so my main thoughts on this as an acronym are, it just seems to me strange that the way it gets used as interchangeable with transphobe, because even if TERFs are real, even if this is some subset of transphobes are indeed radical feminists, it just seems to me that most hate in this world of any sort is not specifically coming from feminists, let alone radical feminists, because there just plain are not a lot of radical feminists out there. And radical feminists, I would assume, are a bit more, it varies. Obviously, there could be hate coming from anybody, but attuned to sort of gender issues than most. And that it seems like this notion, what gets to me about the term is it seems like it's even allowing that this is out there, like this meaning radical feminists who I'm saying like cases where, this does not always happen, but where a radical feminist would intentionally misgender a trans person, something like that, even allowing that such things do exist, is that where transphobia is headquartered? And it seems like a huge amount of attention gets paid to the transphobia of radical feminists relative to the transphobia of people who are perhaps, cis men and not feminists of any kind. And I guess that's the thing that just jumps out at me about it, the way that TERF has caught on, whereas transphobe sort of less.
Yeah. I mean, I think...
I don't know. It's kind of a side note issue, but but maybe not. I don't know.
My theory is that the focus on radical feminists as enemies of the trans community is really just a question of fighting the battle that it's perceived as winnable. This is a group that holds power in progressive spaces. The radical feminists are perceived as maybe, or as the biggest threat in progressive spaces where the trans community wants to feel safe or feel supported. And so, rather than focusing on like Joe transphobe, who, maybe you never have any contact with them anyway, and has very little impact on your life day to day, you focus on the person.
Would that be the case though? Because don't people kind of in their day-to-day lives, even if online, you can kind of bubble yourself off?
I don't know.
I don't know.
If you are a trans activist, I think the spaces that you're occupying are probably, more overtly political than just...
Well, spaces online maybe, but do you think offline too?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at things like, I don't know, I'm just trying to think, like, the queer community in Seattle, for instance, which is something that Katie Herzog, who writes for The Stranger, has talked about, that there's this a certain amount of conflict there. Again, like if you perceive the queer community to be your primary community, like the place where you're primarily spending your time, and you perceive that there's a subset of people within that community who are a threat to you, then I think you're more likely to focus on them than on, even if they're a larger group, the people out in the wider world who you don't really interact with that much.
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think then maybe what's frustrating about some of this is how a focus that can make sense in a kind of narrow sphere, when brought to like a Times op-ed, for example, or just a sort of a more mainstream conversation, can just not quite add up, because plainly, I mean, I'm just going to keep saying the bulk of transphobia is not coming from radical feminists who are like 3 people, and it's,
Yeah, and that's, I think you're totally right about that.
I don't know. I guess it's, I think in terms of whether, I guess I'm going to come down on, I probably would say I do not think TERF is a slur, because it is not about qualities a person has so inherently, you know what I mean? Like I think the question is, does TERF get thrown around in the way that some other terms might, to refer to people who may not even be trans exclusionary radical feminists? And I guess in as much as it does, then maybe, but if it is just specifically about a particular, I don't know. I guess the only thing that throws me off is the frequency with which there's like violent rhetoric accompanying it. And then I'd say we're back in that realm you're talking about, where even if it's your own name, if it's got that kind of mood going.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I think, I mean, who knows? I think I might, I guess what I don't like is this notion of ever increasing numbers of words that you can't like write down without having to like have a disclaimer before them. Because I feel like there's a reason with the N-word. I don't know if there's a reason with so many terms, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Like that you would only ever be able to, not just to use it in quotes, but like to really explain your use of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But so are we think slurs though are dehumanizing, right? That was something we wanted to, I think.
Yeah, I think their goal is to dehumanize.
I think their goal is to dehumanize.
When used by, when aimed at somebody, when reclaimed by the group in question, probably not. So,
although, are you always for the, see, I'm not always for the reclaiming, because I know that there's been this attempt to reclaim Jewess. And I know that that's like the thing. And I just, I don't know.
It's just so funny because somebody used that word to describe me online, and I was sort of like, okay, technically, I guess, like, in an ethnic sort of way, yes, but I'm not sure. But is it offensive? See, like this is how
I think to me it just seems like going for something antiquated and gendering a word that didn't need to be gendered. Like, I mean, it's weird, I guess, also to me, because like in French that just like it would be gendered regardless, but to do that in English, I don't know. I don't know why it doesn't sit right with me. I'll have to think about that. But we've been chatting for a while. I don't know if we have.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So let's call it. Let's call it.
All right.
And not call each other any slurs or slur adjacent.
What if I say cat? Then you would have to say Phoebe back to me.
Phoebe. This is a very Seinfeld sign off.
Newman.
Jerry. All right. Till next time.
Till next time. It's been Feminine Chaos.